Chapter 1. When fire becomes merely coals. Night begins not with darkness, but with the retreat of light. It does not extinguish abruptly like a curse, but recedes slowly, yielding space to voids where the eye, accustomed to seeing, finds nothing left to hold on to. In the low stone room, the fireplace holds only a few embers, dark red like memories that refuse to die completely. Beeswax from an old candle runs down its side in a crooked line, freezing midway, leaving behind a heavy, sweet smell mixed with old smoke, the scent of nights that have passed and promise nothing new. This is the time when stories are told correctly, not to warn, nor to lull to sleep with illusions of safety, only to place everything upon the cold stone table, where the truth needs no cover, because no one demands it be easy to hear. People used to believe that the story of the wolf was to teach young children to stay away from the deep forest. But the deep forest does not need children to avoid it. It is the forest itself that has been avoided, carved up, and called by other names until no one remembers its original shape. That story, transcribed, illustrated, and read in a gentle voice, fulfilled a different duty. It allowed humans to point a finger at a creature with teeth and claws and call it the cause of all loss. The wolf in this story did not step out of the shadows to sow terror. He had been there long before the darkness was named. He did not carry hunger as a threat, but as a prolonged condition, silent, gradually hollowing out body and memory. When the story began, he was already old. Not the romantic old age of silver fur and experience, but the old age of worn joints, of teeth once sharp now remaining only as cracked enamel shards, of a body learning to lie still to conserve warmth. The forest at that time was silent in an unnatural way, the silence of absence. No more sounds of small animals running in dry leaves, no smell of fresh droppings marking territory, only the wind, weaving through cut-short tree trunks, whistling a narrow and long sound, as if the air itself was forced through passages that no longer belonged to it. Under the cold, damp soil, tree roots lay bare like finger bones, clutching the void where life used to be. The wolf remembered clearly the moment he realized the forest had died before he could die with it. It was not a dramatic moment, just a morning with nothing to track, an afternoon with nothing to wait for. The empty stomach no longer roared. It fell silent, shrinking, as if accepting its new position in the changing order. People often ask, in the retold versions, why the wolf was so cruel. That question assumes cruelty is a choice, not a label pasted on after all context has been stripped away. No one asks why the forest has no animals. No one asks why houses spring up right at the tree line, emitting the smell of meat smoke and hot metal. No one asks why an old creature, accustomed to the natural cycle of birth and death, must learn to exist in a world where death is considered a personal failure. In the faint glow of the embers, one can clearly see what remains on the wolf's body. Fur thinning and dull, old scars that no longer hurt but never fully healed, breath carrying the smell of rusty iron, the smell of blood dried long ago in the mouth. Teeth, once tools, once symbols, are now just cold, hard memories. Chipped teeth cannot bite into words, cannot chew on myths, yet are used to build an entire story of savagery. This is the opening ritual, not meant for excitement. All warnings have become superfluous. When the light has retreated and darkness sits down as an obvious fact, there is no longer any reason to hide the nature of this story. It does not speak of innate evil. It speaks of the necessity of a form to bear collective guilt. The fire continues to fade. The candle continues to run. And in the quiet interval between two gusts of wind, the story begins to drift. Slow, heavy, and with no intention of turning back. Chapter 2. The Last Footprint on Dirty Snow. Snow used to be a form of honest recording. It kept every movement, without judgment, without selection, simply quietly printing signs of what had passed over its fragile surface. But by a certain winter, the wolf was no longer sure how many he had lived through. The snow ceased that duty. It was no longer white, it was mixed with ash, with mud, with horse manure and oil drops falling from wheel axles. A stretch of gray background where footprints could no longer tell a clear story. The wolf stepped out of the rock crevice on a morning cold enough that breath froze before the nose. The ground was hard. The sound of his own footsteps rang out dryly, sounding as if they did not belong to a living creature. He paused for a long time, head bowed low, nose touching the ground. Old habits remained, more durable than hope. But the scent led nowhere. There was no hunting path, no sign of the pack, only a chain of overlapping human smells. Leather, smoke, metal, overwhelming everything else. In the old days, snow told who had passed and in which direction. Now, it only showed quantity. Many shoe prints, large and small, pressing upon each other until the ground was compacted like an affirmation. This is no longer a path for beasts. Old deer hoof prints, faint to the point of being mere depressions of uncertain reality, were erased clean by wheels and iron nails. History was overwritten, not by immediate violence, but by ceaseless repetition. The wolf stood amidst that emptiness and realized a subtle but decisive change. The forest was no longer felt as a seamless body. It had been cut into patches, into segments, each segment carrying a different level of danger, not for humans, but for what remained of nature. There were places where the smell of gunpowder lingered in the wind, hot and acrid. There were places with the smell of sweat and the fear of livestock confined in closed pens, and there were spaces completely empty, where there was nothing for a scent to cling to. The last footprint the wolf could read was not of prey. It was the footprint of another wolf, smaller, printed faintly on the edge of the snow, where rare light slipped through the bare branches. That footprint did not go straight. It meandered, as if the one leaving it had hesitated, had turned back a few times before vanishing. The old wolf did not know what had happened to that other one. There was no blood, no shed fur, only an absence that lasted too long for hope to remain. From then on, the snow was no longer a map. It became a surface of oblivion. Every time the wind blew, that layer of dirty powder shifted, filling in the last weak traces of an old order. The wolf walked slower, not just because of age, but because there was nothing left to chase. Every direction led to the same conclusion. It wasn't that the forest was shrinking, but that another world was swelling, pressing upon it from all sides. At the far edge, one could hear the sound of metal striking together. Rhythmic, intentional. Axe sounds, hammer sounds. Those rhythms were not hurried, not aggressive. They carried the confidence of one who knows time is on their side. Each beat ringing out was a silent affirmation that snow, forest, and the creatures that once read them were only temporary. The wolf turned his head, not to flee, but because there was no reason to move forward. In the prolonged silence after the last metal sound, snow continued to fall, thin and sparse, like a belated effort to cover what had been decided beforehand. Under that snow, the old wolf's footprints were gradually filled in, not by a storm, but by the slow indifference of a world that had learned not to look back. And the forest, if it could still be called by that name, began to get used to no longer being tracked. Chapter 3. The Hunger Without a Sound. Hunger, when it lasts long enough, ceases to scream. It retreats from the sense of urgency, from the violent contractions that once forced the body to act. Instead, it becomes a silent foundation, a cold plain upon which every thought must step. The old wolf had lived long enough to understand this. He no longer dreamed of fresh meat, no longer visualized warm pulses beneath thin skin. Those images required energy, and energy was something no longer in surplus. By day, he lay long in the rare shade remaining under a hollow tree trunk. Rotting wood gave off a familiar musty smell, mixed with cold earth, a smell promising nothing but endurance. His back touched the hard ground, where the cold no longer shocked, simply existed. The body learned to allocate warmth like a dwindling asset, keeping it for the heart, for the lungs, for the non-negotiable parts. Other parts accepted the cold as a given. There was no more hunting in the old sense. Chasing another creature over long distances was now a calculation wrong from the start. Instead, there was waiting. Not waiting for opportunity, but waiting for the end. The wolf observed small changes, the way light shifted sluggishly on the bark, the way the wind carried the smell of metal whenever it changed direction, the way silence became thicker when there was nothing to interrupt it. Sometimes, the hunger became light enough to allow memories to surface. Not useful memories, but leftover fragments. The sensation of clean snow melting under the tongue, the sound of the pack moving as a single body, the warmth radiating from bodies pressed together in the cold night. Those memories did not carry sharp pain. They wore down, like teeth, every sharp edge planed flat over time, until only the shape remained. The empty stomach now sent no signals. It shrank, silent, like a locked room that no one tries to open anymore. This, in a way, made things more bearable. No demands, no resistance, only minimal existence maintained by habit and inertia. The old wolf understood that his body had begun preparing to disappear, step by small step, without fanfare. Around him, the forest continued to retreat from itself. Small animals that once lived by the shelter of the canopy had disappeared first. Birds no longer nested in low branches. Insects appeared rarely, then vanished quickly, as if learning that staying too long was a mistake. The food chain did not collapse with a snap. It was withdrawn link by link until nothing was left to connect. The wolf did not name this process. Naming requires a belief that naming can lead to change. He only recorded. Like an archivist with no readers, he let every detail settle, layering into sediment of truth. That hunger was not the enemy, but a sign showing a system had reached a point where it could no longer repair itself. When twilight lingered longer than usual, or perhaps simply because there was nothing left to distinguish time, the wolf stood up, slowly, careful with every movement. Joints cracked with a small, dry sound, like old wood being bent. He took a few steps, then stopped, not from fatigue, but from realizing that no destination was different from the point of departure. Every path led through the same void. In the thickening darkness, hunger continued to exist, soundless, formless. It did not urge, did not threaten. It was simply there, like a final reminder that when the world changes slowly enough, even life learns to retreat without leaving a sound. Chapter 4. Houses sprouting like poisonous mushrooms. The houses did not appear all at once. They did not flood into the forest like an army, did not carry shouting or flags. They came one by one, quietly, patiently, as if testing how the ground would react if a strange shape were placed upon it. At first, it was just a low hut, wood still new, the smell of pine resin not yet fully evaporated. Then another one, not far away, with a hastily erected fence and a carefully trodden path. The old wolf watched that process with an attention devoid of hope. He did not understand the meaning of building houses at the forest edge, where the wind was colder and the soil harder to tame. But gradually, that meaning revealed itself through scents and sounds. The smell of wood smoke spread steadily every afternoon, carrying warmth intended for no one but those inside. The sound of metal striking wood, even and firm, like the heartbeat of a new creature learning to exist. Each house carried a private zone of silence, not the silence of nature, where things still move even if they make no sound, but a forced silence, where grass does not grow tall, where soil is compacted until rainwater cannot seep down. The wolf realized that the forest was not pushed back by a clear boundary line. It was gutted, patch by small patch, each patch enough for a family to set foot on and call their own. Fences appeared later. Rough wooden slats, nailed unevenly, but carrying a unified message. They were not meant to stop wild beasts, at least not beasts in the biological sense. They were meant to create a sense of control, a line for those inside to believe the world had been redivided according to their will. The old wolf did not try to cross, not because of fear, but because he understood that the fence was not a physical obstacle, but a statement. And those statements are often protected by things that cannot be negotiated. At night, oil lamplight shone from small windows, yellow and steady. That light did not dispel the darkness. It only carved rigid holes into it. The wind carried the smell of burnt grease, the smell of meat being cooked, the smell of organized excess. The wolf's stomach did not react. Hunger had gone too far to feel envy. But another part of him recorded this as historical data. Energy does not disappear. It just changes place. Dirt roads gradually formed, connecting the houses together. They followed not the logic of terrain, but the need for the fastest movement between 2 points. Trees were felled in inconvenient places, leaving low stumps and sawdust soaking up rain, smelling slightly sour. The wolf walked past such a stump and stopped, placing his nose on the rough surface. No smell of living sap, only the smell of dead wood, a death not accepted as part of a cycle, but as a necessary condition for construction. Gradually, the houses began to look at the forest in a different way. They turned their facades toward the trees, placing windows in positions that allowed observation without stepping outside. The forest became a backdrop, something to be viewed from within, through glass, while hands remained warm and feet remained dry. The old wolf understood that from that moment, he and what remained of the old world had been converted into an image, beautiful, distant, and with no right to demand anything. There was no confrontation, no explosive moment to recount, only accumulation. Every tree felled, every house erected, every fence added a slat, was a small step, reasonable enough not to be questioned. And it was that very reasonableness that made this process irreversible. The old wolf retreated deeper into the parts still thick with growth, not to defend territory, but to prolong existence a little longer. He understood that those houses did not need to advance further. Just by standing still and continuing to be present, the forest would shrink itself, like a body avoiding prolonged pain. In the weak light of a late afternoon, when the smell of smoke and rotting wood mixed together, the wolf realized that the houses occupied not just the land. They occupied the story. And from here on, whatever happened in the forest would be told from the side of the lit windows. Chapter 5. The girl wearing the color of warning. Red did not belong to the forest. It did not spring from the damp earth, did not fade with rotting leaves, did not blend into the shadows like the browns, grays, and greens that had learned to exist here long ago. When the red color appeared on the narrow path cutting through thinning trees, it carried a clear dissonance, like a heartbeat striking the wrong rhythm in an old score. The old wolf saw the girl from afar, not by sight first, but by the disturbance in the air. The wind carried the smell of new fabric, the smell of still warm bread, the small metallic smell from the basket hook, smells not belonging to the forest, but also not heavy enough to be the smell of the village. The girl walked with the concentration of an assigned task, looking neither left nor right, stopping long at no point, as if the road existed only to be completed, not to be felt. The red hood wrapped around her head was not jewelry, it was a sign. In nature, such colors often accompany toxins, warnings, reminders that approach must be considered. The old wolf did not assign it moral meaning. He only recorded, "This is a young creature," carrying a sign making it more visible than necessary, walking through a space no longer safe for innocence. The girl did not sing, did not skip. Those details were added later, when the story needed lightening. In this reality, small steady steps, breath short from cold, hands clutching the basket handle as if grasping the only reason to keep going. The path underfoot was packed hard by too many passings, flanked by low grass and trees pruned of low branches, signs of a path made safe by removing shelter. The old wolf stood still, half his body submerged in tree shadows. He did not advance, did not retreat. The distance between them was maintained like a wordless agreement. In that moment, he realized something needing no deduction. The girl did not belong to the forest, and the forest no longer belonged to him. They met in a temporary overlap, where both were hitchhiking through a system arranged by people not present there. The smell of fear was unclear. It mixed with the smell of cheap soap and light sweat, not strong enough to trigger a predatory reflex, if that reflex still existed. Hunger, like a sedimentary layer, did not rise into a command. Instead was a deeper fatigue, cognitive in nature. Whatever happened next would not end here. The girl passed by. The red color glided across the gray-brown background of the forest like a streak of ink on old paper. No exchange of glances, no recognition. And precisely that non-recognition, was the detail worth preserving. In later stories, they would be placed in opposition, like two opposing forces unable to coexist. But in this slowly drifting reality, they were just two entities caught in the same current, in different positions. When the girl had gone far, the old wolf stood still for a long while. The wind changed direction, bringing the smell of the house at the forest edge, the smell of old medicine, the smell of a weakening body, the smell of a death being postponed. He understood that this path did not lead to a single event, but to a convergence point where many abandonments met. A child given a task too early, an old person pushed to the margin, and a creature having lived too long to still be considered necessary. In the silence returning after the red color disappeared, the forest did not react. It did not shudder, did not warn. It had learned to let everything pass without speaking up, and the old wolf, with teeth no longer weapons, turned his head slowly, knowing that from this moment, the story would no longer belong to what actually happened, but to what needed to be believed. Chapter 6. Grandmother's House and the Smell of Old Blood. The house lay where the forest began to apologize for still existing. It was not deep, not quite far, just deviated enough from the main road to no longer be convenient. That distance, just enough to say one still cared, just enough not to have to take responsibility, was something humans understood very well, though rarely named. The old wolf had known of this house for a long time, not because it was important, but because its smell did not change with the seasons. The smell of blood here was not new. It was not sharp, not hot, did not carry the panic of a sudden end. It was the smell of old blood, dried in the body before it could touch the ground, the smell of prolonged exhaustion. Mixed in was the smell of cheap herbal medicine, the smell of uncleaned urine, the smell of damp fabric not given enough sun to dry completely, a composite smell of surviving too long in a space decided to be temporary. The old wolf approached the house not with the steps of a predator, but with the familiarity of a creature who had learned to walk around things that could no longer be changed. The wooden door was closed, but not securely. The gap was wide enough for wind to slip through, carrying cold in and the inside smell out. Every time the wind shifted, that smell thickened, like a call with no intention of being answered. The old woman lay on a low wooden bed, her body curled up as if trying to save space. The blanket covering her was thin and heavy with a damp smell. Her breathing was intermittent, uneven, as if every beat had to be carefully considered before being allowed to happen. The old wolf watched that scene through the small window crack, the glass blurred by dust and steam. He did not see a victim in the sense the later story would need. He saw an entity placed outside the cycle of care, left to drift to the endpoint alone. In nature, death usually has witnesses, the pack, the young, or at least other creatures that will use what remains. Here, death was kept secret, hidden behind wooden walls and the politeness of distance. No one wanted to look directly at it. No one wanted to bring it home. So it was left at the edge, along with things no longer fitting the accelerating rhythm of life elsewhere. The old wolf did not enter immediately. He stood there in the sparse tree shadows and recorded a truth needing no judgment. If he did not exist, if there were no teeth, no claws, no shape easily named, this death would still happen, just without a story simple enough to retell. The old woman would disappear in silence, and that disappearance would be accepted as natural, needing no further explanation. When he stepped in, the wooden floor let out a dry, light creak, not loud enough to wake, just enough to announce a small change in a room too accustomed to no changes. The smell of old blood became clearer, not because of proximity, but because there was nothing else to mask it. The old wolf stopped a few steps from the bed. He did not pounce, did not move fast. Chipped teeth were no longer capable of a clean finish, and the very idea of finishing here had become vague. The old woman opened her eyes. The gaze was cloudy, unfocused, sliding over the wolf's shape as if sliding over a misplaced object. No scream, no recognition of an enemy, only a weak reflex, a breath held, then released slowly. In that moment, the old wolf understood that fear had left this room long ago, along with the strength to resist it. What happened next was not neat, not symbolic. It was a series of clumsy, slow movements, full of limitations from both sides. Death did not come as a blow, but as an overlap between two decays. When it ended, there was no moment of victory, only a silence heavier than before, as if the house had just lost the last reason to keep heat. The old wolf stepped back, carrying the smell of old blood soaking further into his fur. He did not eat much, not out of morality, but because the body was no longer capable of receiving. The stomach contracted slightly, then fell silent again. Outside, the wind continued to blow through the door crack, carrying that smell to the forest, where it would soon dissolve into the general background smell of rotting wood and cold earth. The house at the forest edge returned to its initial state, an empty structure waiting to be assigned another story, and the old wolf, turning to walk away, did not know, and did not need to know, that this very moment would be polished, simplified, and handed to children as a lesson. Here, in the unretold reality, there was only a naked truth. Death had arrived where it had been waiting for a very long time. Chapter 7. When teeth are no longer weapons. There was a time when teeth were the answer to every question of survival. They needed no explanation, no justification. They existed to bite, to hold, to tear, and to end. But time, the thing never accounted for in stories needing a clear villain, had done its work patiently. It did not take the teeth in a single night. It ground them down gradually, like water grinding stone, until the tool became evidence. The old wolf felt this clearly when closing his jaw. No sharp clashing sound, just a dull contact, lacking precision, accompanied by a small but persistent pain spreading to the skull. Enamel cracked long ago, exposing the inner part sensitive to cold and pressure. Every bite was no longer an instinctive act, but a risky test. The body no longer trusted the very things that used to be its foundation. In the retold stories, wolf teeth are always white and even, always ready. They are drawn larger than reality, sharper than reality, as if just visualizing them is enough to create the necessary fear. But here, in a reality with no audience, teeth were just exposed bone, enduring more than causing. They did not growl, they did not threaten, they simply existed, carrying traces of every use and every failure. The old wolf understood that from this moment, he no longer fit the role assigned to him. A predator unable to hunt effectively is no longer a predator. He became a creature in between, too dangerous to be pitied, but too weak to truly threaten. That very gray zone is where myths are born, because it needs to be simplified for easy telling. He licked across the chipped teeth, tasting the familiar iron of his own blood, not another's. That taste brought no stimulation. It only confirmed something known for a long time. This body was consuming itself to maintain presence a little longer. Hunger did not disappear after the house at the forest edge. It only changed shape, becoming silent and deeper, like a debt with no due date left. In the forest, other creatures, if they could still be called that, had learned to avoid the wolf not out of fear, but because his smell carried information. The smell of decay signaled that contact brought no benefit. No easy meal here, no strength to compete. Nature, in its remaining parts, still operated by a cold and precise logic. The old wolf moved slower, not to stalk, but to avoid collision. Every step was calculated to cause no further damage. He chose soft dirt paths, sections with thick rotting leaves to reduce pressure on joints. This was no longer hunting skill, but the skill of minimum survival, a silent adjustment unrecorded in any epic. And then, in the prolonged silence between two identical days, the old wolf realized the core thing stories never admitted. Human fear aimed not at current strength, but at the memory of strength. Wolf teeth no longer held blood, but the image of them was still sharp enough to cut through reason. It was that very image, preserved, polished, that would become the replacement weapon, more effective than any real teeth. When night fell, cold and odorless, the old wolf lay curled under a rotting stump, jaw closed without purpose. He did not dream. Dreams required energy and a future. Only a final recording of the day, dry and clear. From here on, teeth would no longer be tools of survival, but evidence for the world to tell another story. A story needing no truth, only a shape scary enough to believe. Chapter 8. The Hunter and the Necessity of Monsters. The hunter did not come from the forest. Though his cloak carried the smell of animal hide and old smoke, though his boots had learned to step through mud without faltering, his origin lay elsewhere, in rooms with straight walls and stories told in order. He stepped into the forest with a completed purpose, like an answer seeking a prepared question. The old wolf recognized that presence before seeing the shape. The smell of clean, cold metal, unmixed with the sweat of fear. The steady pace, unhesitating. This was not a wanderer. This was one called upon, empowered to end something identified as a problem. In this logic, the wolf did not need to do anything more to be a criminal. His existence was enough. They met in a clearing where the forest was so thin that light fell straight down, unfiltered by canopy. The hunter stood tall, hand resting lightly on the knife hilt. His gaze did not seek truth. It sought confirmation. The old wolf stood still, gaunt frame unable to hide weakness. That moment lasted just enough for two value systems to glide past each other without touching. In stories needing quick telling, the hunter is the symbol of order. But order, when built on the need to simplify, needs a convergence point for all anxieties. The wolf, with teeth, with fur, with history cut off from context, was the most suitable shape. He understood this by professional instinct. No monster, no role. No role, no just cause to act. The blade was drawn without a sound. Metal absorbed light instead of reflecting it, as if it too did not want to be the center of attention. The old wolf did not growl, did not retreat. The chipped jaw closed unconsciously, not to attack, but as an old remaining reflex. The body understood that every movement now would only clarify a story already written. The moment of violence, when it came, was not heroic. It was short, clumsy, and lacking glory. No battle of wits, no clear victory, only a decisive intervention, aimed at completing the role. Blood, little and dark, soaked into the soil so fast it failed to form a shape. The earth, accustomed to receiving, did not react. The hunter stood there for a long time afterward, not to regret, but to memorize the image to bring back. He needed a neat version, the ferocious wolf, destroyed, the danger, handled, the unfitting details, chipped teeth, emaciated body, the smell of long hunger, would be left behind with the carcass, for they made the story hard to tell. When he left, the forest did not change, no sigh of relief. No instant recovery, only a new void, where once there was a creature that had learned to exist in conditions no longer meant for it. That void was quickly filled with low grass and fallen leaves, like every other void. Nature keeps no list of merits. What was brought back was the story. It would be retold by brighter fireplaces, with a more certain voice. It would teach that there are dangers needing removal for life to continue smoothly. And while children nodded and adults breathed lightly, the forest would continue to shrink, needing no monster to justify its own disappearance. In that new order, the old wolf was no longer present. But the need for a shape-to-shoulder fear remained intact. It would find other names, other sets of teeth, as long as the story was kept simple, and the light inside the house did not have to shine outside. Chapter 9. Death Retold for Children. Death, when leaving the place it occurred, rarely keeps its shape. It is wiped clean, rearranged, and attached to words round enough not to scratch the listener. The old wolf was no longer there to witness this process, but that was unnecessary. What happened next followed a rule repeated enough times to need no witnesses. The story was retold by brighter fireplaces, where fire did not die but burned steadily, where the smell of new candles drowned out the smell of rotting wood. The telling voice was slow, confident, having removed all hesitation. The wolf became larger, healthier, more malicious. Teeth were whitened, jaws made strong. The long hunger, the thing that had worn him down from the inside, had no place in this version. Hunger cannot teach a clear moral lesson. Evil can. The old woman was condensed into a fragile symbol, carrying no smell of old medicine or prolonged abandonment. The girl was made clearer than reality, steps lighter, heart simpler. Complex details, the house's location, the distance just enough to forget, the convenience of sending a child as a substitute, were folded up and put away. Children do not need to know structure. They only need to know who is right and who is wrong. Images were drawn to support the narrative. The forest greener, thicker, like a dangerous but attractive place. The house small and pretty, windows bright. And the wolf, always in the center, placed in the frame as a black spot needing removal. The disappearance of the forest, of animals, of the growing voids was not mentioned. They did not fit the concise rhythm of a bedtime story. Children hearing this story grew up with a simple moral map. They learned to fear the right designated thing, and thus did not need to fear other things. Things without teeth, without claws, but capable of changing an entire landscape. Well-managed fear is a useful tool. It keeps eyes turned toward the named darkness, rather than the changes happening slowly in the light. In the final version, the hunter is the solution. He appears at the right time, acts decisively, brings order. The wolf's death becomes a conclusion, a round full stop. No one asks what comes after that dot. No one needs to know that houses continue to spring up, that roads are still widened, that the forest still shrinks even without a monster to blame. The story fulfills its duty. It lulls to sleep. It allows listeners to close their eyes with the feeling that the world has been arranged logically. Sharp edges have been planed flat, hard questions replaced by memorable images. In that process, the old wolf, the one who lived long enough to become inconvenient, was given a permanent role, frozen in a form that no longer resists. And like every successfully edited memory, this version begins to overwhelm reality. It is repeated, printed, passed from mouth to ear, until the initial truth becomes blurred, no longer sharp enough to cut through the new layer of paint. The old wolf, if still remembered, exists only as a convenient warning, a name used to keep order for sleep. In the silence after the story, when the child has sunk into dreams and the adult returns to private thoughts, the forest out there does not raise a voice in protest. It learned silence long ago, and precisely in that silence, what is not told continues to happen, steadily, and without needing anyone to believe. Chapter 10. The Rotting Stump No One Remembers. Not every death leaves a corpse, and not every corpse is recognized as a death. There are things that simply stay too long in a form no longer named, until that very form dissolves into the general background of earth and wood. The rotting stump, where the old wolf used to curl up in his final nights, was such a place. It was not prominent. It carried no memorial sign. It simply existed, low and hollow, like an unrequested reminder. The tree trunk had died before the wolf sought it out. Inside was hollow, wood eaten away by moisture and time, leaving a dark cavity just enough to hold the wind a beat longer. The soil around it was soft, cold, always slightly wet, as if never fully dry. The old wolf chose this place not for safety, but because it demanded nothing. Nothing to protect, nothing to fight for, just a space allowing the body to be put down. If someone walked past, and usually no one did, they would only see an old stump, useless for logging, not worth clearing. They would not recognize the smell of old fur soaked into the wood grain, not recognize faint claw marks on the earth blurred by rain. Those signs were not designed to last. They only existed enough until no one needed to read them. The old wolf lay there in the final hours, breath thinning, not following any predictable rhythm. The body no longer struggled, no images returning, no instinct rising. Hunger, once the foundation of all sensation, had also retreated, as if fulfilling its role. Only an even weight remained, pressing down on the earth, then lightening, until indistinguishable between body and cold ground. There was no moment to call an end, no clear cut point between alive and dead, just a small shift, where warmth ceased holding shape, and matter began returning what it had borrowed. The earth received. Wood kept apart. Wind took away the lightest things. The rotting stump did not remember the wolf's name. It did not need to. In the old system, the system pushed back, names were not a condition for existence, only continuation. And here, continuation happened without noise, carrying no moral meaning. An entity withdrew. The void was filled. The process completed without explanation. When seasons changed, grass grew around the stump, thin and pale. Insects returned, bit by bit, not for memory, but because conditions were temporarily suitable. No sign showing this place was once the end point of a story. And precisely that, the lack of traces, is how nature closes what is no longer invited to exist. Chapter 11. When the forest sleeps without dreaming. When all stories have been told, when necessary images have been fixed in collective memory, what remains is not a lesson, but a long silence. That silence does not wait for attention. It does not need filling. It simply spreads out, even and blurred, like dew settling on cold ground before dawn. The forest, if it can still be called that, continues to exist in a dreamless state. The remaining parts do not envision recovery, do not remember lost forms. Dreaming requires a future, and the future, here, has been allocated to other structures, houses, roads, stories. The forest only does the only thing left possible to do: keep silent. In the houses on the edge, fires still burn steadily. Children grow up, learning to recognize the correct designated fear. Adults continue retelling the story with a familiar voice, no longer recognizing the parts cut out. Everything operates smoother when there is no need to question what vanished without leaving a sound. The old wolf does not return in anyone's dreams, not because he has been forgiven, but because his role is finished. That shape has been used up, framed, and put away in the archives of imagination. What remains, earth, wood, smell of dampness, is unsuitable to become symbols. They continue to exist outside the story, unnoticed, but no less decisive. And that is the final echo, not of a death, but of a tacit consensus, that a monster is always needed for everything else to happen without scrutiny. When the monster has been removed, the gaze does not turn outward, but turns inward into the house, where everything has been arranged for comfort. Night closes as it always does. No sign, no declaration. Fire fades to coals. Candles melt to the last part, then extinguish. In that uniform darkness, the forest sleeps without dreaming, and sleep comes not because of safety, but because nothing is hidden anymore.